Hello, thank you very much for the invitation to come here and speak to you today. It's an honor to be here to talk about some aspects of my research. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Oslo, looking into multinational corporate group structures and how they can hold informal control over affiliated entities, not showing the control relations. So, to begin with, what is the problem? Transfer pricing, shareholder registries, international business companies, and trust. I think we're all very well familiar with the buzzwords that easily comes to mind when we are discussing the topic of transparency. However, all of these buzzwords, they are only single pieces of the puzzle of what the multinationals are using to operationalize their businesses. So, I would argue that the real problem is that we tend to not fully understand how these organizational structures look like and how they can be financially engineered together. But the problem is that if we do not understand how these organizational structures are created or really are looking, then how can we really ensure or assess how the regulations that are governing these structures, whether they are efficient or not? And even though law, as Beate Schofield told us, cannot be the only solutions to making the transparency possible, I would argue that it really is a crucial matter on how we govern the multinational entities. So put differently, if you do not understand what a corporate group really is, then inevitably the result will be that our regulations is only addressing the tip of the iceberg. And I will use the next 20 minutes to explain you a little bit how that works. So, first of all, we have an issue with the non-existence of a corporate group definition. Today's corporate groups, they can cover anything from a very integrated entity, only being comprised of a parent company, maybe one or two subsidiaries, but it can also cover hundreds or thousands of affiliated entities, sometimes in the same business, sometimes also conglomerates, which are into different businesses. From an historical aspect or context, corporate groups, they were legally accepted by an amendment in the legal acts in the beginning of the 1900s, some countries in the late 1800s, where we said that one legal entity can be a shareholder in another legal entity. Before this time, we had only had the individual entities. But what happened was that even though there are crucial differences when a single person, or the state for that matter, was a shareholder in a legal entity, company, it's only when one company has shares in another or controls another when we are faced with a corporate group. However, not legislators nor judges manage to see this crucial difference and create separate laws that reflects this difference. So, the corporate group exists where one legal entity controls another. But for the corporate group, it's not only how we saw for the legal entity that the investor was shielded for its economic risks by creating a private limited liability company. Actually, the corporate group, they were given a second veil, as we can say, by not only externalizing the risks of the investor, but furthermore externalize the risk that was in the company. So think about a car manufacturer. Back in the days, we had one legal entity, we had one company where the investor could not running the risks of actually losing his house if something went wrong. But when we had this legal amendment that the corporate groups can be shareholders, they could start splitting up the business. So they can say, let's have one company who will create the wheels, let's have one company who do some other parts of the car, and if something goes wrong in one of these entities, the risks is isolated in one company. So it's a second veil, it's a double protection. It's quite fascinating to see that the legislation for corporate groups has not really changed too much over the years. From around 1920 and 1930, corporate groups is understood to be the primary way to organize business. Still, we have a very narrow reflection of how control, for example, actually looks like. As a matter of corporate law, control could either be held by shareholding, one company holding, for example, 51% of the shares in another, but it can also be by contracts. In the 1980s, there was a general consensus that shareholding should serve as the primary way of actually defining control, because we really needed a formalistic perception of when is a structure a corporate group and when is it not, because they needed some formalistic framework for when to file consolidated accounts, and also for tax purposes. However, by limiting the perception of a corporate group to only when you have shareholding between two entities, we had some issues by actually not taking into considerations trusts, for example, based on contractual regimes, the actually legal effect of long-term shareholder contracts or agreements, and also other long-term contractual relations. This was actually very easily shown by some of the banks' really creative use of special purpose entities in a banking crisis, where instead of holding shares as controlling another legal entity, they established a new private limited liability company where they could sell all of the bank's very bad assets. So they sold them to the new separate legal entity. They controlled the new legal entity by contracts so that the bank could serve as a consultant to this new legal entity. But because there was not a share connection between the two entities, the banks and a new entity, the bank didn't have to file this new entity into its consolidated accounts. And this was how the banks could really reduce the requirements of the liquidity that was needed in the banking regulations. So, in terms of company law, one of the really first shortcomings in the law is that we understand a corporate group as a collection of separate legal entities. And as many of you know, a corporate group is often not at all, in practice, a collection of separate legal entities. Actually, it usually is the core rationale for creating a corporate group is to divide the business into separate entities, as I already told you, to externalize concrete risks, or often also to explore regulatory loopholes, or also just regulatory favorable regulations in other countries. For example, in environmental damages or the use of chemicals, it's very common to set up entities in Bangladesh, Vietnam, where the chemical regulations are quite differently than what we are known from the EU. But when the law is actually looking at the corporate groups as a collection of single legal entities, I would say, put very easily, is the same as putting an equation between a random pile of pine needles and the compass system of an anthill. Because the corporate group can be understood as similar to a compass system as an anthill. It actually is the individual system of each corporate group who creates the group. So looking at it too easily has been a very fruitful choice of law option for the corporate groups who are gaming regulations and the systems by actually running under the radar for being separate entities. So the second shortcoming of the law, I would say, we found in the 1980s and the 1990s, where our very formalistic understanding of shares as the only, or primarily, control mechanism between legal entities was challenged by the derivatives revolution in finance. In the 1980s, 1986, the UK took a lead in deregulating their financial markets. So before 1986, we always looked at a share, or still many corporate lawyers, they look at a share as a standardized financial instrument. So if you buy a share, one share in Norway, for example, in Statoil, you will have a perception of having a right to vote. You can have dividends if the board decides so, and so forth. You have a list of rights that you will hold. But what happened when they deregulated the financial markets is that they created the ability to split that single share and the rights or obligations connected to that share onto separate, distinct financial instruments. And what happened also was that what was before a share standard, who most often was dealt with over a financial market, now was occasionally dealt with on markets, but occasionally private between parties. And this is where the very big problems with the so-called over-the-counter derivatives entered the picture. So what we can see from the picture is that what was a standardized instrument has been split up to distinct entities or instruments by intermediaries. And the question is, when the rights connected to a share is split up into separate components, can we then always identify a beneficial owner or someone to be registered in a public share registry? So these two aspects, the one with having only the very limited perception of a corporate group as a collection of single entities, but also the awareness of what financial instruments may add to this picture of this formalistic understanding of control, can be illustrated by the accounting, as we all very often talk about, as a transparency tool, or who should be one of our, as Beate Schofield also told us, it should be something that overlooks what is happening in the companies. And the international regulation on financial accountancy has its own definition of control, meaning when a corporate group should actually file a consolidated account. Even though this was actually amended after the awareness of what banks did in the banking crisis, establishing these special purpose entities and managed to shop assets in and out of the group to fix or make the consolidated account look more appealing. We still can see that there are crucial limitations for when corporate groups should assess a consolidated account. Because in order to be under an obligation to file a consolidated account, you should have a power, which is very often a voting right. You should have a right to returns, very often the right to receive dividends. But the crucial thing here is that you should have a linkage between the power and the right to returns. And this means all of the financial instruments that are actually splitting the right of someone having the voting rights and someone holding the economic rights to returns or exposure, then you are no longer under an obligation to file that type of control in your consolidated account. So still, we are not yet there. And this was, amongst others, very easily shown by, in 2008, when Porsche wanted to do a takeover of Volkswagen. Porsche held about 41% of the shares in Volkswagen, and they addressed the market about that they wanted to do a takeover. They wanted to bring the families together in one legal entity. And the market, all of the other investors, they acted upon this information from Porsche, buying, selling. And one random October day, Porsche went out to the market and exposing that not only did they control or hold 41% of the shares in Volkswagen, in addition, they had 32% of the shares by prepaid options. So in reality, they had 73% of the shares in control, but they were only under an obligation to disclose to 41%. And this shows how our regulations have a very limited perception of what this type of control is, that you actually can hold control over legal entities without necessarily exposing it. So who makes it all possible? We have been talking about Panama Papers and the law firms there that was involved. But it's not only law firms, it's consultants, of course, and it's very often also connected to the banks. If you look at the international bank today, and in their structures, we will probably be quite surprised on how many different types of industries they are involved in. Because most often they are a conglomerate who can have both highly investments in car manufacturing or clothing industry and also banking industry. And the creative people who works here, they are the ones who also are spearheading many of the new financial instruments that comes to the market. It was also mentioned earlier today that financial markets, they are global in nature. So if some new development comes on the market in Asia somewhere tomorrow, they will very easily be on the market, on the European market, maybe not the day after, but maybe next week. And it's said that at least one new derivative is addressed on the financial markets every week. So trying to catch up with all of the individualized aspects that these derivatives can make, it's quite hard. So one of the main arguments I've heard after the Panama Papers is that this is really the evidence that we need more transparency, we need more information. So the question is how to go about that. Is it really more information that we need? And if so, more information on what? I would argue that in light of these financial engineering developments, we should at least have transparency connected not only to the investor or the intermediaries, and we should certainly not have only transparency requirements connected to the economic obligations or rights or the organizational rights, which can enhance or disclose what kind of control or what kind of beneficial owners who really is at the end of a long chain. Because today, the legislation very often, as I've shown you with the consolidated accounting requirements, they only address 2 or sometimes 3 of these aspects. One of the problems with actually making transparency possible is been discovered or explored a little bit in complexity science and network science. People working with big data and looking into how the market actors actually are adjusting to new legislation. So when we want to assessing corporate groups, looking into how they are moving money in between entities and all these things, one of the key arguments we are using as lawyers is we have to do something with our regulation. The inherent difficulties and problems with legislation is the fragmentation. So this is what, of course, the multinationals are exploring, that it will never be a harmonized level, either in tax levels or other types of legislation. So we see that in practice, the corporate groups, they will, of course, adjust. And they will do it also by making an opacity. They will make their structures into, like using trusts, for example, which are much less transparent than traditional limited liability entities. And they will also hold an interconnectedness between affiliated companies, sometimes being part of the consolidated account and sometimes not. And the dynamics of this is that a corporate group, very many of our corporate groups, they are not time consistent. They are changing over time as a part of their strategies to explore new potential loopholes. And this is also, of course, possible to technology. So in our search for making transparency possible, we need to bear in mind that there are two components that we need to take into consideration. And that is first the information costs for the society to actually assess or understand more concretely these practices that the multinational entities are using. But even more importantly is what is denoted bounded rationality. And that is each and every one of us, individual ability to actually process the information we achieve. And I can give you an example of this from the financial crisis in 2007-2008. The credit default swaps, which was at the epicenter of the financial crisis, they were in reality covered by full transparency regulations. So the problem was not transparency, it was the rest of us ability to actually understand what these kind of instruments were. And of course, this was because it was layers and layers and layers and layers of financial instruments and different types of debt connected in together, and to actually understand the risks that lies in this type of financial instruments is nearly impossible. I talked to many auditors, and they say the same. If a derivative, as the credit default swaps were, betting against the housing market, if they have, or in our context corporate groups, and the control relation on the shares that are the connecting factors for creating a corporate group, if there are enough layers in that financial instrument, then it's very, very difficult, and many auditors would say it's impossible to set a fixed pricing of that instrument, or to actually say that this or this or this person is actually in control. And then we may be ending up with, if we want to, or if we think that we always can find a beneficial owner, the question is, will that beneficial owner always be the bank who is putting these instruments together? And I don't think we are willing to say that. So this leads me to my last slide, which is, in our search for making transparency possible, I think it's crucial that we have a better conception of what a corporate group really is. It should be understood as a whole and not as a collection of separate entities, because it's actually the misunderstanding of not looking into it as a whole that creates all of these transfer pricing issues, that you can move around money in between connected entities without regarding it as a whole. We should also take into consideration that our legislation as it is per today is actually not taking into consideration the internal aspects of the corporate group, that it actually is a system, and there is central steering to a quite long extent in corporate groups, which is not supported in the law at all. So here we see a huge gap between the separate entities, and that the board of the individual entities are to only consider that individual entity as their core value to be protected. But in practice, a corporate group is centrally steered and to get resource efficiently allocated in between. In Norway, this is actually very often in breach with company law, that we do a central steering, and we can very easily assess the question of whether the entity should be identified instead of being upheld as separate legal entities. And if we fully want to understand how the corporate group can hold control over other legal entities, typically if they are engaging in something very environmental damaging, or they want to move money around in the world, they can hold control through other mechanisms than only holding 51% of the shares of a legal entity. Because if you look into tax law, very often we have a perception of transfer pricing, for example. That if we are looking into two affiliated companies, we are putting on our very strict glasses and asking, was this agreement made on the right pricing parameters? Or is this actually a deal which is too good to be true between affiliated entities? But if you're looking to, if the assessment is one company giving a very good deal to another company which is not affiliated, will we then do the same assessment? Probably not. So, if we want to make transparency possible, then we should really work more into actually understanding the underlying structure that is used to operationalize taxing or operationalizing everything else in the law, because this very business practice and the very differences that we find from the practice and how things is regulated in law is actually one of the key issues if we want to make transparency possible. Thank you.